32 years. That's how long the Lions have had to wait in between playoff wins. Detroit has only made the playoffs 13 times in the 58 years of the Super Bowl era that began all the way back in 1966. The Lions didn't even win a playoff game until 1991, and 1 week later, they lost in the NFC Championship game. Then Detroit had to wait all the way until the 2023 season for their second postseason win and NFC Championship appearance. It's been nothing but pain and misery for Detroit fans. There was once a glimmer of hope back when Matthew Stafford was in town, but he never won a playoff game there. Instead, he was traded and won a ring of his own with the Rams. And in that trade, the Lions got Jared Goff, the quarterback that would ultimately lead them to a playoff win. And he'd do it alongside Dan Campbell, who played for Detroit during that winless 2008 season. That was rock bottom for the Lions, but the hard times are over. Since the AFL-NFL merger back in 1970, nobody has won less in the playoffs than the Detroit Lions. For the first 21 years after the merger, Detroit only made the postseason 3 times and lost their first game each time. That was until 1991, when the Lions beat the Cowboys 38-6. Dallas actually contained Barry Sanders, but Eric Kramer torched them through the air. Finally, the Lions had won a playoff game. That excitement lasted all of a week before Washington blew them out 41-10 in the NFC Championship game. Then, over a 7-year period in the 90s, Detroit made the playoffs 5 of 7 times, but again, lost each time. That's when things started to get really bad for the Lions. From 2000 to 2010, the Lions didn't make the playoffs once, but then Detroit made the postseason in 3 of the next 6 seasons, and a lot of that was thanks to Matthew Stafford. In 2009, the Lions took him first overall out of Georgia. He had a pretty rocky start in the pros, but he broke out in 2011 with 5,000 yards, 41 touchdowns, and 16 interceptions. Stafford was pretty consistent, throwing for 20 or more touchdowns in 8 straight seasons and passing for over 4,000 yards in 7 straight. He's absolutely a Lions legend and had a very successful 12 seasons in Detroit, just not in the postseason. Stafford just couldn't win in the playoffs, at least until he went to the Rams. There, he immediately had a 41 touchdown, 17 interception season and won the Super Bowl. All Stafford had to do was leave Detroit to have playoff success. But the Lions' time was coming, and all thanks to a guy who never played with Stafford but was on the team that helped them get him. 2008, the Lions went 0-16, becoming the first team to lose every game in a 16-game season. Detroit ended up getting the first overall pick after a year that was filled with injuries. One of those injuries was to Dan Campbell, the future savior of the Detroit Lions, just not on the field. Dan Campbell was drafted in the 3rd round by the New York Giants in 1999 and went on to spend 4 seasons there, including in 2000 when they made the Super Bowl and got blown out by the Ravens. In 2003, Campbell was one of the first few guys to sign with the Cowboys after Bill Parcells was named head coach, but Jason Witten was obviously the top tight end there. Unfortunately, injuries were just a really big part of Campbell's NFL career. He only played in 3 games in 2004 because of torn ligaments in his foot. Then in 2006, Dan Campbell was a free agent and signed with the Detroit Lions. In his first season in Detroit, he had 308 yards and 4 touchdowns. Both were career highs. He also had 21 receptions, 1 away from tying a career high. Now, he didn't put up the flashiest numbers, but Campbell was known as a blocking tight end. Unfortunately, he only played 3 more career games after that. He suffered an elbow injury in 2007 and landed on injured reserve again the following year because of a hamstring injury. Campbell signed with the Saints in 2009, reuniting him with Sean Payton, who was his offensive coordinator with the Giants and Cowboys. Campbell suffered an MCL injury in training camp, and because of that, he didn't even get a ring when the Saints won the Super Bowl. Dan Campbell spent 11 total seasons in the league, playing 114 career games with 91 catches for 934 yards and 11 touchdowns. In 2010, he started his coaching career as a coaching intern for the Miami Dolphins under Joe Philbin. Campbell was then promoted to the tight ends coach after a single season and had that role up until 2015 when Philbin was fired. fired, and Campbell ended up becoming the interim head coach. After a 1-3 start, Miami went 5-7 under Campbell. After that season, Campbell became the Saints' assistant head coach and tight ends coach under Sean Payton. He was there for 5 seasons before finally he got the call to become a head coach. The Detroit Lions hired Dan Campbell in 2021, and immediately the Lions looked completely different because that March, the Lions traded away Matthew Stafford to the Los Angeles Rams. In return, the Lions got 2 first-round picks and a former first overall pick, Jared Goff. Goff was left for dead by the Rams, and they clearly wanted to move on after his 5 seasons in Los Angeles. His rookie year was a complete disaster, but after Jeff Fisher was fired and the Rams hired Sean McVay, suddenly, Goff was a different player. He had 3,800 yards, 28 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions in 2017. It was a promising sophomore season, and clearly, it was only the beginning. 2018 was magical. Goff had the best statistical season of his career, with 4,688 yards and 32 touchdowns, both career highs and 12 interceptions. That Rams offense really ran through Todd Gurley, though, who was unbelievable. He rushed for 1,250 yards and 17 touchdowns and had 580 yards and 4 touchdowns receiving. Not only that, but both Robert Woods and Brandon Cooks had over 1,200 yards, and Cooper Kupp had 566 in 8 games before he tore his ACL. So I think it's safe to say that the positional players around Goff were really good, and so was the coaching. And that's a big reason why the Rams made the Super Bowl. Well, that and maybe the worst missed pass interference call in NFL history that happened in the NFC Championship. Nickel Roby-Coleman absolutely laid out Tommy Lee Lewis before the ball got there, and there was no flag. If he had caught it or the penalty was called, the Saints could have run out the clock before a game-winning field goal. But instead, the Rams won it in overtime with a 57-yard field goal after a Drew Brees interception. Now, the Saints had their chance to win the game, but they just couldn't score. And that's something that the Rams couldn't do in the Super Bowl against the Patriots. It was a defensive battle, and New England ended up winning 13-3. And in that game, Jared Goff threw a late pick to Stephon Gilmore while the Rams were moving down the field, trailing by a touchdown. The Rams had their chance at a ring and couldn't make the most of it. And the next season, they didn't even make the playoffs. Goff had just 22 touchdowns in 16 games and had a career-high 16 interceptions. I'd argue that it's his worst year as a pro other than his rookie year. He wasn't really that great in 2020 either, with 20 touchdowns and 13 interceptions. The Rams were right there on the cusp of a Super Bowl win, and it felt like not only were they regressing, but so was Jared Goff. They did end up making the playoffs in 2020 and even beat the Seahawks in the wildcard round, but lost to the Packers in the divisional. There was no doubt that the Rams were still a talented group that may just be one piece away, and it sure does feel like they thought that one piece was quarterback. That's why they traded Goff in 2 firsts for Stafford, and it worked. In year 1 with his new team, Matthew Stafford won the Super Bowl when the Rams beat the Bengals. Now, I'm willing to bet that most Lions fans were rooting for Stafford, and while it wasn't Detroit that won, it was still pretty cool to see him win in the postseason. But meanwhile, it felt like the Lions were nowhere close. The beginning of the Dan Campbell and Jared Goff era in Detroit was pretty ugly. 2021 was a long season for them. Heading into their Week 9 bye, the Lions were 0-8 and coming off of a 44-6 loss to the Eagles. It's hard for things to get much worse than that. Luckily, things were about to change because in Week 10, the Lions didn't lose. They also didn't win, and it really felt more like a loss, but the Lions got into field goal range twice in overtime. Goff took a bad sack that pushed them out of field goal range on the first possession, and then Ryan Santoso missed a potential game-winning 46-yard field goal. He also missed an extra point in the third quarter that let the Steelers tie the game with 2 field goals. It wasn't pretty at all, but at least the Lions didn't lose. They then went on to lose back-to-back close games after that to drop to 0-10-1, and people were starting to make comparisons to that 2008 Lions team. It was bad, but Detroit just kept on fighting. long, and it may have taken them all the way until December, but the Lions got a win, and it came in dramatic fashion. They were at home playing the Vikings, and Minnesota was leading late. How late? Well, before the final play of the game. Detroit had the ball on the Minnesota 11 with 4 seconds remaining on 4th and 2, down 27-23. It doesn't get much closer than that, but Goff came through. He hit Amon-Ra St. Brown for a touchdown, right in front of 2 defenders, and straight chills. The best part of that game winner had to be Goff sprinting over to the sideline and giving Dan Campbell a hug. That was his first win as a head coach, Goff's first win as a Lion, and Amon-Ra's first as a pro. St. Brown actually had a pretty impressive rookie season with 900 yards and 5 touchdowns after being a 4th-round pick. He was a great find for Detroit. In that same draft, they also took Penei Sewell 7th overall. Both Sewell and Amon-Ra were first-team All-Pros this past season. St. Brown now has back-to-back 1,000-yard seasons and is coming off of 1,500 yards and 10 touchdowns in 2023. He's been the clear top target for Goff, who has been much better in Detroit since his first year when he had just 19 touchdowns and 8 interceptions. 2021 was tough, but after a brutal start to the season, the Lions actually finished the year 3-3. It perfectly dropped the Lions to the 2nd overall pick, where they ended up taking Michigan boy Aiden Hutchinson, who a lot of people thought should have gone 1st overall instead of Trayvon Walker. Hutchinson has already racked up 21 sacks in 2 seasons and just made the Pro Bowl. 10 picks later, the Lions drafted Jameson Williams. Now, he missed a lot of the 2022 season, still rehabbing a torn ACL that he suffered in the national championship at Alabama, and this past season, he was suspended for 4 games for betting on NFL games. He still hasn't done too much as a pro, but he's young, and hopefully we'll actually get to see him play a full season in 2024. During the 2022 offseason, the Lions were on Hard Knocks. Every year, the team on Hard Knocks gets hyped up and is expected to be better than they really actually are. And Detroit was a prime example of that, because they started the year 1-6. It didn't really feel too much better than the season before. The Lions were supposed to just be a better team, and they were, because eventually it clicked. After going into week 9 1-6, the Lions got hot, and they finished the year 9-8. To have a winning record in a season where you started 1-6 is crazy. Goff threw 10 more touchdowns than the year prior and had 1 less interception. At that point, it was clear that Dan Campbell was building something in Detroit, and that led to big expectations for 2023 that ended up paying off. A big reason for the Lions' success this season has been their rookies. Detroit had 6 picks in the first 2 days of the draft, and it was their first 4 selections that were all big impact players. Jahmyr Gibbs was taken 12th overall and ended up rushing for 900 yards and 10 touchdowns. The Lions then took Jack Campbell at 18, fresh off a Butkus Award out of Iowa. Detroit ended up going Iowa again, 34th overall in the 2nd round, taking tight end Sam Laporta. He was just named a 2nd-team All-Pro after having 889 yards and 10 touchdowns. He's really filled the shoes and even more of TJ Hawkinson, who the Lions traded away to the Vikings during the 2022 season. Then at 45, the Lions took Brian Branch, a top safety in the class out of Alabama. The Lions also went on to sign CJ Gardner-Johnson and David Montgomery, who have both been really important to this team as well. The 2023 season started off with a bang for this team. Detroit played in the first game of the regular season on Thursday Night Football and ended up beating the reigning Super Bowl champion Chiefs 21-20. If expectations weren't already high for this team, they went through the roof after that. The Lions did drop a game in overtime to the Seahawks the next week, but responded with a 4-game win streak. Now, I can't just gloss over week 7. Detroit lost 38-6 to the Baltimore Ravens. Baltimore proved that they were a big dog and did really whatever they wanted to the Lions. It was ugly, but it didn't rattle the Lions' season. They finished the year 12-5, and it would have really been 13-4 if the refs correctly identified Taylor Decker as an eligible receiver on a 2-point conversion against the Cowboys, but it is what it is. The Lions won the NFC North for the first time since it's even been called that. Funny enough, the Buccaneers had literally won their division more recently than they had. Of course, that set up the Lions with a home playoff game. Detroit had lost 9 straight postseason games going back to 1991. For reference of how long ago that was, the then Redskins won the Super Bowl after beating the Buffalo Bills in what was their second straight Super Bowl loss before losing 2 more in a row. Buffalo running back Thurman Thomas was NFL MVP, and no, I was not even close to being born yet. Lions fans wanted a playoff win, some for the first time in their lifetime. But ironically, it was gonna have to come against Matthew Stafford. The NFL scriptwriters were cooking with this one. It was the only one possession game during wildcard weekend, and it ended 24-23. The Lions got the ball up 1 with 4:07 remaining and ran out the clock, ending 32 years of misery. Versus Matthew Stafford, who was supposed to be the Lions' savior, Jared Goff and Dan Campbell finally delivered Detroit a playoff win. And the next week, Detroit won again, sending the Lions back to the NFC Championship for the first time since 1991. Whether it's now or in the near future, one thing is clear. The Lions are contenders, and they aren't going to stop biting kneecaps off anytime soon.